The Americans, Chapter 17, The Progressive Era, Section 1, The Origins of Progressivism. Camelia Tioli was just 12 years old when she began working in a Lawrence, Massachusetts textile mill to help support her family. Soon after she started, a machine used for twisting cotton into thread tore off part of her scalp. The young Italian immigrant spent 7 months in the hospital and was scarred for life. 3 years later, when 20,000 Lawrence mill workers went on strike for higher wages, Camelia was selected to testify before a congressional committee investigating labor conditions such as workplace safety and underage workers. When asked why she had gone on strike, Camilla answered simply, "Because I didn't get enough to eat at home." She explained how she had gone to work before reaching the legal age of 14. A personal voice, Camilla Tioli. "I used to go to school, and then a man came up to my house and asked my father why I didn't go to work. So my father says I don't know whether she is 13 or 14 years old. So the man say, 'You give me $4 and I will make the papers come from the old country, Italy, saying that you are 14. So my father gave them $4, and in 1 month came the papers that I was 14. I went to work, and about 2 weeks later got hurt in my head." After 9 weeks of striking, the mill workers won the sympathy of the nation as well as 5 to 10% pay raises. Stories like Camilla's set off a national investigation of labor conditions, and reformers across the country organized to address the problems of industrialization. Part 1. 4 Goals of Progressivism. At the dawn of the new century, middle-class reformers addressed many of the problems that had contributed to the social upheavals of the 1890s. Journalists and writers exposed the unsafe conditions often faced by factory workers, including women and children. Intellectuals questioned the dominant role of large corporations in American society. Political reformers struggled to make government more responsive to the people. Together, these reform efforts formed the Progressive Movement, which aimed to restore economic opportunities and correct injustices in American life. Even though reformers never completely agreed on the problems or the solutions, each of their progressive efforts shared at least one of the following goals: protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, and fostering efficiency. Protecting social welfare. Many social welfare reformers worked to soften some of the harsh conditions of industrialization. The social gospel and the settlement house movements of the late 1800s, which aimed to help the poor through community centers, churches, and social services, continued during the Progressive Era and inspired even more reform activities. The Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, for example, opened libraries, sponsored classes, and built swimming pools and handball courts. The Salvation Army fed poor people in soup kitchens, cared for children in nurseries, and sent slum brigades to instruct poor immigrants in middle-class values of hard work and temperance. In addition, many women were inspired by the settlement houses to take action. Florence Kelley became an advocate for improving the lives of women and children. She was appointed Chief Inspector of Factories for Illinois after she had helped to win passage of the Illinois Factory Act in 1893. The act, which prohibited child labor and limited women's working hours, soon became a model for other states. Promoting moral improvement. Other reformers felt that morality, not the workplace, held the key to improving the lives of poor people. These reformers wanted immigration and poor city dwellers to uplift themselves, immigrants and poor city dwellers to uplift themselves by improving their personal behavior. Prohibition, the banning of alcoholic beverages, was one such program. Prohibitionist groups feared that alcohol was undermining America's moral foundation. Founded in Cleveland in 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, spearheaded the crusade for prohibition. Members advanced their cause by entering saloons, singing, praying, and urging saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol. As momentum grew, the Union was transformed by Francis Willard from a small Midwestern religious group in 1879 to a national organization. Boasting 245,000 members by 1911, the WCTU became the largest women's group in the nation's history. WCTU members followed Willard's Do Everything slogan and began opening kindergartens for immigrants, visiting inmates in prisons and asylums, and working for suffrage. The WCTU reform activities, like those of the settlement house movement, provided women with expanded public roles, and they used to justify giving women voting rights. Sometimes efforts at prohibition led to trouble with immigrant groups. Such was the case with the Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1895. As members sought to close saloons to cure society's problems, tensions arose between them and many immigrants, whose customs often included the consumption of alcohol. Additionally, saloons filled a number of roles within the immigrant community, such as cashing paychecks and serving meals, creating economic reform. As moral reforms sought to change individual behavior, a severe economic panic in 1893 prompted some Americans to question the capitalist economic system. As a result, some Americans, especially workers, embraced socialism. Labor leader Eugene V. Debs, who helped organize the American Socialist Party in 1901, commented on the uneven balance among big business, government, and ordinary people under the free market system of capitalism. A personal voice, Eugene V. Debs. Competition was natural enough at one time, but do you think you are competing today? Many of you think you are competing. Against whom? Against oil magnate John D. Rockefeller? About as I would if I had a wheelbarrow and competed with the Santa Fe Railroad from here to Kansas City. Though most progressives distanced themselves from socialism, they saw the truth of many of Debs' criticisms. Big business often received favorable treatment from government officials and politicians and could use its economic power to limit competition. Journalists who wrote about the corrupt side of business and public life in mass circulation magazines during the early 20th century became known as muckrakers. The term refers to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, in which a character is so busy using a rake to clean up the muck of this world that he does not raise his eyes to heaven. In her History of the Standard Oil Company, a monthly serial in McClure's magazine, the writer, Ida M. Tarbell, described the company's cutthroat methods of eliminating competition. Mr. Rockefeller has systematically played with loaded dice, Tarbell charged, and it is doubtful if there has been a time since 1872 when he has run a race with a competitor and started fair. Fostering efficiency. Many progressive leaders put their faith in experts and scientific principles to make society and the workplace more efficient. In defending an Oregon law that limited women factory and laundry workers to a 10-hour day, lawyer Louis D. Brandeis paid little attention to legal argument. Instead, he focused on data produced by social scientists documenting the high costs of long working hours for both the individual and society. This type of argument, the Brandeis Brief, would become a model for later reform litigation. Within industry, Frederick Winslow Taylor began using time and motion studies to improve efficiency by breaking manufacturing tasks into simpler parts. Taylorism became a management fad as industry reformers applied these scientific management studies to see just how quickly each task could be performed. However, not all workers could work at the same rate, and although the introduction of the assembly lines did speed up production, The system required people to work like machines. This caused a high worker turnover, often due to injuries suffered by fatigued workers. To keep automobile workers happy and to prevent strikes, Henry Ford reduced the workday to 8 hours and paid workers $5 a day. This incentive attracted thousands of workers, but they exhausted themselves. As one homemaker complained in a letter to Henry Ford in 1914, "That $5 is a blessing, a bigger one than you know, but oh, they earn it." Such efforts at improving efficiency, an important part of progressivism, targeted not only industry, but government as well. Part 2. Cleaning up local government. Cities face some of the most obvious social problems of the new industrial age. In many large cities, political bosses rewarded their supporters with jobs and kickbacks and openly bought votes with favors and bribes. Efforts to reform city politics stemmed in part from the desire to make government more efficient and more responsive to its constituents. But those efforts also grew from a distrust of immigrants' participation in politics. Reforming local government. Natural disasters sometimes played an important role in prompting reform of city governments. In 1900, a hurricane and tidal wave almost demolished Galveston, Texas. The politicians of the city council botched the huge relief and rebuilding job so badly that the Texas legislature appointed a 5-member commission of experts to take over. Each expert took charge of a different city department, and soon Galveston was rebuilt. This success prompted the city to adopt a commission idea as a form of government, and by 1917, 500 cities had followed Galveston's example. Another natural disaster, a flood in Dayton, Ohio in 1913, led to the widespread adoption of the council-manager form of government. Staunton, Virginia, had already pioneered this system, in which people elected a city council to make laws. The council, in turn, appointed a manager, typically a person with training and experience in public administration, to run the city's departments. By 1925, managers were administering nearly 250 cities. Reform mayors. In some cities, mayors such as Hazen Pingree of Detroit, Michigan, 1890 to 1897, and Tom Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, 1901 to 1909, introduced progressive reforms without changing how government was organized. Concentrating on economics, Pingree instituted a fairer tax structure, lowered fares for public transportation, rooted out corruption, and set up a system of work relief for the unemployed. Detroit city workers built schools, parks, and a municipal lighting plant. Johnson was only one of 19 socialist mayors who worked to institute progressive reforms in American cities. In general, these mayors focused on dismissing corrupt and greedy private owners of utilities, such as gasworks, waterworks, and transit lines, and converting the utilities to publicly owned enterprises. Johnson believed that citizens should play a more active role in city government. He held meetings in a large circus tent and invited them to question officials about how the city was managed. Part 3. Reform at the state level. Local reforms coincided with progressive efforts at the state level. Spurred by progressive governors, many states passed laws to regulate railroads, mines, mills, telephone companies, and other large businesses. Reform governors. Under the progressive Republican leadership of Robert M. La Follette, Wisconsin led the way in regulating big business. Fighting Bob La Follette served 3 terms as governor before he entered the U.S. Senate in 1906. He explained that, as governor, he did not mean to smash corporations, but merely to drive them out of politics and then to treat them exactly the same as the other people are treated. La Follette's major target was the railroad industry. He taxed railroad property at the same rate as other business property, set up a commission to regulate rates, and forbade railroads to issue free passes to state officials. Other reform governors who attacked big business interests included Charles B. Aycock of North Carolina and James S. Hogg of Texas. Protecting working children. As the number of child workers rose dramatically, reformers worked to protect workers and to end child labor. Businesses hired children because they performed unskilled jobs for lower wages, and because children's small hands made them more adept at handling small parts and tools. Immigrants and rural migrants often sent their children to work because they viewed their children as part of the family economy. Often, wages were so low for adults that every family member needed to work to pull the family out of poverty. In industrial settings, however, children were more prone to accidents caused by fatigue. Many developed serious health problems and suffered from stunted growth. Formed in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee sent investigators to gather evidence of children working in harsh conditions. They then organized exhibitions with photographs and statistics to dramatize the children's plight. They were joined by labor union members who argued that child labor lowered wages for all workers. These groups pressured national politicians to pass the Keating-Owen Act of 1916. The act prohibited the transportation across state lines of goods produced with child labor. 2 years later, the Supreme Court declared the act unconstitutional due to interference with states' rights to regulate labor. Reformers did, however, succeed in nearly every state by effecting legislation that banned child labor and set maximum hours. Efforts to limit working hours. The Supreme Court sometimes took a more sympathetic view of the plight of workers. In the 1908 case of Muller v. Oregon, Louis D. Brandeis, assisted by Florence Kelley and Josephine Goldmark, persuasively argued that poor working women were much more economically insecure than large corporations, asserting that women required the state's protection against powerful employers. Brandeis convinced the court to uphold an Oregon law limiting women to a 10-hour workday. Other states responded by enacting or strengthening laws to reduce women's hours of work. A similar Brandeis brief in Bunting v. Oregon in 1917 persuaded the court to uphold a 10-hour workday for men. Progressives also succeeded in winning workers' compensation to aid the families of workers who were hurt or killed on the job. Beginning with Maryland in 1902, one state after another passed legislation requiring employers to pay benefits in death cases. Reforming elections. In some cases, ordinary citizens won state reforms. William S. Uren prompted his state of Oregon to adopt the secret ballot, also called the Australian ballot, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. The initiative and referendum gave citizens the power to create laws. Citizens could petition to place an initiative, a bill originated by the people rather than lawmakers, on the ballot. Then voters, instead of the legislature, accepted or rejected the initiative by referendum, a vote on the initiative. The recall enabled voters to remove public officials from elected positions by forcing them to face another election before the end of their term, if enough voters asked for it. By 1920, 20 states had adopted at least one of these procedures. In 1899, Minnesota passed the first mandatory statewide primary system. This enabled voters, instead of political machines, to choose candidates for public office through a special popular election. About 2/3 of the states had adopted some form of direct primary by 1915. Direct election of senators. It was the success of the direct primary that paved the way for the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Before 1913, each state's legislature had chosen its own United States senators, which put even more power in the hands of party bosses and wealthy corporation heads. To force senators to be more responsive to the public, progressives pushed for the popular election of senators. At first, the Senate refused to go along with the idea, but gradually more and more states began allowing voters to nominate senatorial candidates in direct primaries. As a result, Congress approved the 17th Amendment in 1912. Its ratification in 1913 made direct election of senators the law of the land. Government reform, including efforts to give Americans more of a voice in electing their legislators and creating laws, drew increased number of women into public life. It also focused renewed attention on the issue of women's suffrage.